What's up everyone, I'm Sublight Drive, and today, I'm not alone. I was recently contacted by Gameyy Builds, another fellow modeler, crafter, YouTuber who I absolutely admire. If you're subscribed to my channel and not his, I don't know how you've managed that, because I really do think of him as one of the heavy hitters out here. Now, we talked through a bit what we might want to do together, and decided that each of us would build most of a spaceship and send it off to the other to finish. Not only that though, but each of us would have to corrupt or infect the spaceship that we receive. So, once we decided on the terms, I got straight to planning. The first thing I knew was that this had to be an original. Normally when I come up with my own designs, they're something that I plan to be reproducible as a kit, but for this one I had a bit more freedom to just do whatever with it. Now, sketching isn't really my strongest skill. I'm honestly a little jealous of how Gameyy's concept sketches are good enough for him to sell as prints, but this is still an important part of my process for getting designs out of my head and onto the page. By the time that I'm actually cutting plastic, I'll be working out most of the details on the fly, but I still need to have a general shape that I'm working towards. After I filled up a few pages of shapes, I came up with this basic setup. I knew I wanted to include some curves, since I don't usually get to for my originals. From there, I drew up some shapes in Affinity Designer, and then sent them over to my Cameo for cutting them out on styrene sheets. Since picking up this machine, I've gotten a lot of questions about what settings are best for cutting styrene, and I've kind of held off on answering because I didn't really know the answer. But now that I've had some time to play with it, this is what I've settled on. Highest pressure, lowest speed, and a pretty shallow cutting depth. On my machine, I set it to about 2 or 3 out of 10, but I'll admit I don't really know what that's being measured in. I use the same settings for both 1mm and 0.5mm styrene, since I'm not trying to cut all the way through. These are going to be 2 halves of a single engine pod, so making sure they're symmetrical is really important. The cut made by the machine is pretty damn precise, but there's always a degree of imperfection that comes from breaking the plastic. The top and bottom halves of the engine pods are curved, so I'm making with the more flexible 0.5mm sheets. My favorite adhesive for styrene is of course Weld On 3, which needs to be carefully transferred to a metal basin before I can apply it. I don't want these pods to be coming apart on me or wobbling around, so I also cut out a bunch of triangular gussets to make the connections extra secure. I've got the 2 halves of the engine pod now, but I want to be able to have access to that little gap in between them. So instead of just gluing them together, I'm going to add some registration posts so that they can come apart and back together really easily. Believe it or not, I actually picked up this specific technique from a woodworking channel. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but the same basic idea is there. Once the posts are in place, I can close up the bottom and move on to cleaning up the edges. I wasn't totally sure how I was going to set up the center portion, so I started out by just cutting out a flat piece that I knew would be the right shape, and some curved pieces to play around with. It was also at this point that I realized I was making a big space crab. I built up some structure in the center here, thinking that this would be the top, and I could add some styrene along the sides to create a curved surface. Unfortunately, although it's pretty easy to make simple curves in styrene like the one going along the top here, I really need more specialized equipment to make the kind of compound curves that would get this to be a streamlined shape. So instead I made the decision to call this the bottom instead of the top and filled it out with a flat piece like this. I still need to add a bit of a twist to close everything up, but that's still easier than a fully curved surface. This leaves some big open gaps in the front, but I'll figure out what to do with those later. So once I took some measurements of the parts I'd already put together, I drew up a shape for the back half and used my Gameyy to cut it out. I probably don't talk about it enough, but a set of digital calipers has become one of my favorite tools, especially when paired with a cutting machine. Being able to take a measurement, carry it over the computer, and then cut out a shape that fits perfectly feels like magic sometimes. It also means that I can easily swap out the shape if I decide I don't like the way it fits. From there, the rest of this back section came together pretty easily, just following the lines I'd already set out for myself. It was at this point that I got distracted thinking about those big empty areas in the front and how to fill them up. So I drew up some little vents or veins or whatever and let the machine cut them out, which meant I got to do the fun part of snapping out like a million of these little guys. Before I stick them in, I measured out the spacing so they'd be mostly even. Once that was done, I wanted to work more on the aft end of things. Just like the engine pods, I wanted this part to be able to come together and apart easily, so before covering everything up, I added some more registration posts. Once those were secure, I could finally finish the structure. For the underside, I knew I wanted it to be a bit more dynamic, but I honestly didn't really have a plan. A sort of pincher or gap for adding more detail felt like the way to go, so I whipped up a shape and put it together. I was checking regularly to make sure everything fit throughout the build, but it was still a big relief when this all came together so nicely. One thing that I did notice was that the whole thing was very front-heavy, even without the claws attached. I'm calling them claws, not engine pods. So to help it balance better, I glued in some pennies as counterweights in the rear. Once it was a little better balanced, I could finally close up the top. At this point, all the main assembly was finished, and I could hold it together if just for a moment. I'm not about to send Gameyy a totally naked spaceship though, so next is adding some details. For starters, I cut out a few panels that matched the shapes of the ship, and then with my trusty machinist scribe engraved some panel lines. Some notches on the sides complete the look, and they're ready to go onto the base. After panelizing most of the body, can't leave Gameyy with nothing to do after all, I want to add some greeblies. I've got here a sprue from a tank kit and a couple pieces from my old fallback, Zabungle kits. part of me wanted to make the engine pods removable from the core, but when it came down to it, it was just easier to glue them in place. And once it was all wrapped up, it was time to ship it away. It was a bit of a strange feeling, taking a project of mine that was barely half done and sending it out into the world like this. Now, even as I record this, I actually have no idea what Gameyy did to finish my model, so if you want to see the rest of this ship story, you'll have to go watch his video to see the rest of it. Speaking of, Gameyy actually finished his half sooner than I did, so just as soon as I shipped away my package, I got to open up the one he sent me and find out what I'm working with. Already I'm saying this is a lot busier than mine was. The base is a Nerf gun of some kind, clearly, and I'm seeing all kinds of parts in here. I recognize some tank pieces, airplane parts, a bunch of Gundam stuff too, if I'm not mistaken, and a few things I don't recognize at all. But that's not all. There's a couple goodies in here just for me. First, a t-shirt featuring some art of his. I'm happy to report that it fits me perfectly, despite men's medium being a nearly meaningless statement in regards to clothing sizing. And second, a whole bunch of stickers, which is stupendous, because I am an avowed sticker fiend. Everything survived being shipped almost perfectly, but I did find this single tank wheel loose in the box. It was pretty clear where it went though, so I just stuck it back into place. Now, I need to start brainstorming what I was going to do to add on to Gameyy's work here. This space here in the back is just begging for a big container or like nuclear battery or something. I also want to break up the silhouette, which is still very Nerf gun at the moment. I'm thinking some big cargo pods on the front will help with that. There's also a few uncovered gaps, but those will get hidden in due course as I start building things up. I finally had a good excuse to cut out some big hexagons, which we all know are the most science-fictional of the regular polygons. Building the pod, I found it needed a whole lot of reinforcement along the inside to hold things sturdy, but eventually I had a good clean hexagonal prism to serve as the base of my cargo pod. I wanted to have the look of a bunch of cargo containers all held in a big modular pod, similar to the Silent Death cargo ship I did about a year ago. This sheet of styrene is pre-scored with a bunch of parallel lines, and broken into little rectangles, it'll give the impression of multiple individual containers. To make sure the gaps between them are even, I also cut out this little T-shaped spacer. And then after a very cool and zen and definitely not mind-numbing few hours of gluing down rectangles, I decided that it was best to go ahead and make a second cargo pod in addition to the first. To complete the look, I added a few more details on the end caps so that they weren't quite so plain. For the big battery in the back, I had these two pieces of an airplane engine nacelle, but they weren't quite big enough to fill the space on their own. I went hunting through all my best circular bits, trying to find a piece that would work to widen them out a little bit, but in the end I just went with the obvious solution and used the other pieces from that same nacelle. Unfortunately, it was just a touch too big to fit easily because of these little posts. I actually really like the look of them, but they gotta go. Sorry, Gameyy, I promise it's the only real change I made to the body. It's a tight fit, but it can get in there now. Before we go any further, I want to cover up some of these spots that still have visible putty from gap filling. Priming would probably hide them, but there'd still be some texture visible, so covering them up. I'm not getting too fancy, just sticking on some styrene I cut into interesting shapes. Now I wanted to mount the cargo pods. The first step of that was connecting them to one another, and then adding a keel that could attach to the underside of the body. The keel needed a little extra reinforcement to stay stable, but I actually really like the look of this. I was a little worried that the connection point wouldn't hold, but when in doubt, add more gussets. Finally, I glued the nuclear battery into place, and then it was time to get to the scary part. Now, you might have noticed that I skipped a few textured panels here on the cargo pod. That's because I haven't forgotten about the prompt here. It wasn't just to finish the model, it was to corrupt it. That means I'm going to try out something I haven't attempted since I was like 8 years old, and do some sculpting. In a second here, I'm going to break out the epoxy putty. But I'm going to first make a rough base for the shape I want using tinfoil. I'm not familiar at all with making organic shapes, but I figured if I get kind of blobby with it, I can't go wrong. That's not all though, because I also want some big gross tentacles reaching their way over the body of the ship. To build up the core of those, I've got this armature wire. And before you ask, I am fully winging it at this point. I watched a few videos to prepare and learn some techniques, but in terms of my own skills, I am in uncharted territory here. My plan was to try and create a skeleton that I could easily remove from the main ship, sculpt the gross tentacles around, and then pop it back into place. In the early stages, I was more or less successful, but the acid test was adding the epoxy putty. I wanted a gross, wrinkly texture that would take well to being painted with washes, so I pulled out this little silicone sculpting tool that I've got. It wasn't perfect, but at this stage I just wanted to get everything together before the putty started to cure, so I stuck it into the wire armature. In retrospect, I probably could have done this earlier. Now, because I wasn't too happy with the texturing that I'd done, I decided to go in with this dried out Hosta leaf that I stole from my porch. It's got kind of a weird veiny look that I think will give me what I want. Sculpting the tentacles turned out to be a lot harder than I expected, considering they're basically just a bunch of tubes, but I figured worst case scenario, it would all look like a gross blob, which, since that's the vibe I'm going for anyway, means if I mess it all up, it'll be fine. Probably. Once the putty was all cured, I really wanted to sell the story that this thing burst out of some cargo containers by ripping up some of the textured pieces I didn't use earlier and gluing them into place. Once those were on, I hit everything with a black primer, and got to my spray booth to paint. I laid down a dark red to be the base across the body of the ship. I've already got my work cut out for me on painting the pods and the blob, so I'm not going too crazy with the rest of it. I did do a little bit of pre-shading in the cargo pods, partially to keep the divider sections nice and dark, but also because a lighter base coat will help with the more colorful containers. The nuclear battery gets a bit of yellow, so we all know it's very dangerous. I tried to put down a pink layer for the blob, but I undermixed it and it came through kind of gray. That's fine though, because I'm going to be building up a lot of layers on there anyway. To paint the individual containers, I cut out a mask from an index card that I could reuse for each color. And yes, just like every other step involved in the cargo pods, this took forever. With that out of the way, it was time to get some preliminary weathering. I mixed up a paler pinkish red and splotched it on over the body of the ship as places where the paint is wearing away. For the deepest scratches, I painted the centers dark gray, where the metal underneath is being exposed. The engines in the back have gone a bit neglected up until now, so to make sure they stand out a bit more, I hit them with a silver dry brush. Nothing fancy or precise, but I think it brings out all those great details that Gameyy put in. As for the blob, I put down a pale peach layer, closer to what I was hoping for with the airbrushing I did earlier. With that covered, I just sort of blopped on some other colors. First a green, and then a darker red. This is finally bringing out all those gross wrinkles that I added in earlier. Once I was happy with that, I moved on to adding decals to the cargo containers. These are the same little logos that I used in my last project from the sheet that I had custom printed. They were definitely looking too clean though, so I sponged on some color to give more of a faded look. From there, I hit the whole thing with a clear coat and then pulled out my oil paints. Black goes in all the deep crevices, and then I wipe it away as much as I can so that the deepest parts stay dark. The cargo containers get the same treatment, though I might have waited a bit longer for it to dry. As it is, I think I pulled most of the paint out of those teeny little lines on the individual containers. As for the very last step, I gotta make sure that the blob is as gross as I can possibly make it, so it gets a glossy varnish. This stuff goes on a bit milky, but when it's dry, it has a slimy, drippy look. And once that was done, I called it a wrap. Now, like I said earlier, I actually have no idea what kind of circumstances Gameyy put my model into, so if you want to see the rest of the process, you'll have to go watch his video. I know I'm curious what happened, and I'm sure you are as well, which is why I'll have it linked in the description. Working with Gameyy has been a whole bunch of fun. I've watched a lot of his videos, of course, but it really is a unique experience, holding someone else's work in my hands, and really being able to see and feel the differences between his and mine. And then, of course, adding my own twist on things. Speaking of, I was definitely pushing myself doing all this organic sculpting. It's a very different kind of skill, and I don't expect to break it out very often, but it was a lot of fun to experiment with on this project. So, a big thank you to Gameyy for suggesting a collaboration in the first place, and I look forward to seeing what he came up with to finish my model. And of course, thank you for watching, liking, subscribing, and etc. So go check out Gameyy's channel. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time.